If you've been writing covered calls for any length of time, you know that there's basically just two scenarios that you could end up in by the time the call expires. Either the stock rises above the strike price and your shares get called away, or the stock stays below the strike price and you keep your shares. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what I do in that first scenario where the stock rises, and I'll explain why I pretty much never buy back my call in order to avoid getting called out. So let's get into it. My name is Charlie, and on this channel I make videos about building wealth and achieving financial freedom so that you can free up your time to focus on the things that you truly care about. Now, as always, if you need a refresher on covered calls, I'll link my full tutorial below, and I do recommend that you check that out first if you're new to covered call writing. But for those of you that have been writing covered calls for a while, you've almost certainly been in the situation where you sell a call against a stock, and then that stock blows way past the strike price and you feel like you're missing out on all of those gains. And in this situation, some people would use a technique known as rolling their call, which means to buy back their call and replace it with a new one further out in time and at a higher strike price so that they can avoid getting their shares called away from them. But personally, I never do that, and to explain why, I want to start off with an example. So let's say you buy 100 shares of stock XYZ at $100 per share, then sell a 102 strike call 1 week out. And we'll say it's a pretty volatile stock, so you bring in a premium of $200. Then, midway through the week, the stock rises all the way up to $105 per share. So at that point, you can't take part in any of the additional upside in the stock if it does continue to rise, because you'll be forced to sell your shares at $102. So it makes sense why someone might want to roll their call at this point, but there are a few reasons that I actually don't think it's a good idea. And the main reason is that rolling your calls essentially eliminates the biggest advantage of covered call writing, which is the guaranteed income that it provides. Because once you sell a covered call, that premium you collect never goes away as long as you don't buy back the call. So even if the stock rises past your strike price and your shares get called away, you'll still have made a great profit on that trade overall. Whereas if the stock rises and you buy the call back, you'll usually have to buy that call back for significantly more than you initially sold it for, which would erase the entire premium that you brought in and more. So going back to our example, let's say you do decide to buy back your call when the stock hits $105 per share. So buying this call back will cost you around $400. Then we'll say you go and sell the 107 strike call that expires the following week, and that brings you in a premium of $325. And of course, I'm just making these numbers up here, but I did backtest with several different stocks, so these numbers are going to be in the ballpark of what you can expect. So in this case, the net premium you brought in is $125 for that 2-week trade, which is just over a 1% return. Then of course you still own your 100 shares, which leaves you with $700 worth of additional potential upside if the stock keeps rising. So the way I look at it is that your guaranteed income from that trade is now just $125 because your premiums are the only thing that can never go away. And that additional $700 is potential income, but it's by no means guaranteed because the stock would have to keep rising in order for you to capture all of that. So now let's compare that to if you just let your call expire and then bought back in and sold a new call the next week. So in that first week, you bring in that same $200 premium for selling the 102 strike call, and you bring in $200 worth of capital gains when you get your shares called away from you. And at that point, that week's trade is completely over. Then at the start of the next week, let's say the stock is trading around $105 still, so we buy 100 more shares and sell another 1-week call, $2 out of the money, for a premium of $200. So in this case, our guaranteed income during this 2-week period is actually $400 because we brought in that $200 premium 2 weeks in a row. And our potential income is also $400 because we're selling both of those calls, $2 out of the money. So you can see that the maximum profit in the second scenario might be slightly lower than in the first scenario when we rolled our call, but the guaranteed portion of this trade is much higher, which to me is the most important thing when you're selling covered calls. And I'm sure some people will be thinking,
well, you assume the stock stayed at $105 for the rest of the week, but what if it kept rising?
And that could happen, so let's say we had to buy in at $107 in the second week instead of $105. It doesn't actually make a difference in terms of our returns because we could still sell the same $2 out of the money call for approximately the same premium and leave ourselves with the same potential for $200 worth of capital gains. So sure, you will own the shares at a higher cost basis in that case, but that doesn't really matter because if you're trading solid companies that are consistently increasing their revenue, that increase in stock price should be justified. As long as the company isn't at some insanely high valuation, that's really not something you need to be worrying about, especially if you're trading mostly solid Dow companies as I like to do. Because the way I look at covered call writing, which has led to a lot of success, is just to focus on making consistent, profitable trades from week to week. Because if you can guarantee yourself 1 or 2% per week from premiums alone, you'll do extremely well over time, and at that point the capital gains are really just the icing on the cake. Now with that said, a lot of people also ask me what I do when I get called out of a stock, so let's go back to my example for a minute. Now you'll remember I bought 100 shares of stock XYZ at $100 per share, then sold the 102 strike call 1 week out. And first of all, I would pretty much never just buy 100 shares, so instead I'd buy about 120 shares right off the bat in order to give myself some more potential upside. So then we'll again say that by midway through the week, stock XYZ rose up to $105 per share. And we'll assume that I still like the stock at this price and I'll want to buy back into it if I do get called out, which is what I do probably about 95% of the time. So I'll pretty much just keep trading the same stocks over and over again until one of three things happens. Either something changes fundamentally with the company that makes it less desirable, the call premiums shrink, usually due to volatility and the stock decreasing, or the value of the company just becomes too high for me to justify buying back in. But again, with the stable Dow components that I like to trade, valuation isn't really a concern right now. But for example, with a stock like Roku, I stopped trading it when it hit around $270 per share because I just saw it to be too risky at that point, even though I did really like the company. And it actually has increased pretty significantly since then, but I just prefer to have the peace of mind of knowing that I'm trading stocks that are a bit less risky. Plus, I do have a few shares of Roku that I'm keeping as a long-term hold, which kind of helps mitigate the whole fear of missing out. But anyways, going back to the example, since my call is $3 in the money with only 2 days left until expiration, I'm fairly certain that I'm going to get called out here. So what I'll often do in this case is get a head start on next week's call. Meaning that rather than waiting until expiration to get my shares called away, then setting up a new call, I'll just go ahead and buy another 100 shares right now and sell a call that expires the following week. So by doing this, you lock in a slightly higher premium because you're selling a call that expires in about a week and a half rather than just 1 week, and you're able to buy into the stock at the current price, which is of course a good thing if you think the stock is going to keep rising. Now obviously I do need to have the cash available to hold 220 shares of the stock until that first call expires, but since I use margin, that's not a problem. So I can just temporarily use my margin to buy those extra shares, and once the first set gets called away, that margin gets freed up. So obviously you only want to do this when you're very certain that the first set will get called away, and you still never want to go too deep into your margin just in case the stock does reverse and you don't actually end up getting called out on that first set of shares. So usually I try to use no more than 40% of my available margin, but when I'm doing this, I may use up to about 50 or 60% of my available margin since I know that it's just going to be temporary. And if you're working with a smaller account where you can't afford to buy another 100 shares, or you just don't want to take that much risk, you can still use a similar strategy. So if you're pretty certain that you're going to get called away and you think the stock is going to keep rising, you can always just buy another 25 or 50 shares on the side, which will allow you to enter next week's call at a slightly lower cost basis. And I found that having these shares on the side also helps with the sort of fear of missing out when you see your stock pass its strike price and just keep going, and you think to yourself that you could have done better if you just hadn't sold a covered call. Because in the long run, you are going to do a lot better when you're selling covered calls as long as you're applying the strategy properly, but I know it can still be hard to see a stock rise like that and feel like you're missing out on all that upside. Now the last thing I want to cover is the one situation where I do buy back my covered call when the stock rises. And that's essentially when the stock rises way past my strike price and the call still has a few weeks until expiration. So for those of you that have been following my Road to Financial Freedom series and my weekly posts on Instagram, you'll know that I did this recently with both Virgin Galactic and Arcimoto. So I'm going to walk through this entire trade with Arcimoto here to show why it made sense for me to buy back the call in this case. So on January 19th, I bought 100 shares at $16.73 per share. Then I sold a February 19th $20 strike call for a premium of $140. So going into that trade, my maximum profit would be my $140 premium plus my potential capital gains of $327. So my maximum profit would be $467. And I would achieve that maximum profit if Arcimoto ended up above $20 per share at expiration on February 19th. But by February 2nd, Arcimoto had already risen up to over $26 per share, and I had noticed that the delta of the call I sold had reached upwards of 0.9, which basically just meant that I had already captured the large majority of the profit in that trade. So what I decided to do at that point was buy back my call and right away also sell the 100 shares. So I bought back the call for a price of $6.90, then immediately also sold the 100 shares for $26.40 per share. So let's take a look at what my total profit ended up being on that trade. So on the call, I actually lost $550 because I had to buy back the call for more than what I initially sold it for. But then on the shares, I made a gain of $967 because I was able to sell them at $26.40 since I no longer had a call sold against them. So my net profit on that trade came out to $417, which you can see was very close to my initial maximum profit of $467. Specifically, it was about 90% of that maximum profit, and to me, missing out on that extra 10% was definitely a worthwhile trade-off because it allowed me to get out of that trade over 2 weeks early. So I could then use that freed up capital to enter another trade where I'd make up that $50 I missed out on and more. And in this case, I didn't want to buy back into Arcimoto because the stock had increased in value so much without anything really changing fundamentally with the company. So in that way, this was also an example of a situation where I wouldn't just automatically buy back into the same stock when I get called out of it. And this example also shows why I usually prefer to sell shorter dated calls about 1 or 2 weeks out rather than a month out. The only reason I even sold the month-long call in the first place is because the option chain for Arcimoto only has one expiration date available per month, so I had no other choice in this case. Either way, the point is that if a stock that you sold a covered call on rises far past its strike price with significant time left until expiration, you may want to take a look at the delta value of your call and see if it's worthwhile to close out that trade early. Generally, I only consider doing this if the delta is around 0.9 or higher, because if it's any lower than that, that means you still have a good amount of profit left to capture in that trade. And in any situation, I'd always recommend doing the calculation yourself, just as I did here, to make sure that the profit on the shares does significantly outweigh the loss you'll be taking on the call. So now, if you haven't seen my video where I cover the most common mistakes that beginner stock traders make, be sure to click that video in the bottom right corner of the screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you all in that next video.